it's Dennis Daly, and welcome to downtown Washington, D.C. I just got off a train at Union Station after coming here from the West Coast. I lived in D.C. for 20 years, and much of that time I was a travel writer. And I had a dream to drive across the U.S. on all the back roads. And that's what you and I are going to do, travel the mom and pop highways between here and San Francisco. The first old road we'll be going on is the National Road. Back there's the Capitol building. That's where they authorized the construction of the National Road in the very early 1800s. It's going to take an hour and a half to get there, so I better go get my rental car.
And after picking up the rental car, I headed to the northern suburbs of Washington first.
And if you'll permit me a side trip on our way out of town, this is Bethesda, Maryland, a wonderful little street called Geranium. And this street has a significance to me, even though it may not mean anything to you. This is 7604 Geranium. My aunt and uncle lived here, and all those times we'd come to Washington, D.C. and visit, they'd put us up. And even in my later years, well, college, when I came out here alone, I stayed here. This is part of taking a long trip. It's going back and finding the memories. Chances are I'll never see this house again, but I just had to see it once more. Now let's hit the road.
And this is very much the way I remember the old road from D.C. up to Frederick.
50, 60 years ago, it didn't look as nice. The road wasn't as pretty, but it'll still get you there. And eventually, we'll be on the Old National Road. Well, we made it to the Old National Road. What little you can see of it now. This was where it entered Frederick, Maryland, and behind me years ago was a classic stone bridge across the Monocacy River. What we're going to do is to take as much of the old pavement as we can downtown and learn about a woman who risked her life to save the flag. And her name was Barbara Fritchie. And what she did happened during the Civil War. As Confederate troops were marching through Frederick, she stuck the American flag out the window and said, "Don't shoot the flag, shoot me." And Barbara Fritchie has become an industry here. What do you know, the old candy cane is still here at what was Barbara Fritchie's restaurant. They used to serve all kinds of ice cream, including Hershey's ice cream. We must have gone past here 40 times in my childhood and never once stopped. And now that I'm stopped, it's been closed for years, they tell me. We drove Old 40 that replaced the Old National Road, but we never drove Old 40 through Boonesboro, the original Old National Road, and that's where we're going next.
And the road to Hagerstown through Boonesboro is really nice, although a little bit more urbanized than I expected.
It's a beautiful building, isn't it? There are a lot of these great stone buildings out here in the East Coast. And right here, in all this traffic going by, on the original Old National Road, is one of the busiest crosswalks in North America, even though it's not marked. For right here, crossing this road, is the Appalachian Trail.
And the trail is 2,200 miles. Some people have hiked the entire thing. We're about here on the trail. It was first started in the 1930s. And so back on the original routing of the Old National Road toward Hagerstown, where I found an interesting surprise downtown.
Hagerstown, Maryland is one of the classic stops on the Old National Road. It's a gritty river town with a hilly downtown, beautiful churches, narrow streets, a train station, and one of the last Roy Rogers roast beefs in America.
It all started in the 1960s when former cowboy singer Roy Rogers teamed up with the Marriott Corporation. The food was absolutely wonderful, and Roy Rogers invented the Fixin's Bar. Over the years, many of the stores were sold off, but now there are a few left. Things have been spiffed up and modernized, and many say the chain's on its way back. From Hagerstown, we head farther into the Appalachians and up Sidling Hill Mountain to one of my favorite places in the entire world.
This has always been one of my favorite places. We are at the top of Sidling Hill Mountain, and this little curve here was the original crossing on the old National Road, and as you can see by the old pavement, original Highway 40. In the late 50s, they cut it lower through here and abandoned this curve at the top of the hill. I always stop here, though, and imagine those old trucks, and before that, covered wagons coming across Sidling Hill, which was a horrible obstacle.
And the ghosts of the National Road and old Highway 40 are all over the sides of Sidling Hill. But sadly, there are places where you can't go any farther.
Here's an example. We were just at the top of Sidling Hill Mountain. This was the old way up that was replaced in 1950 by the newer one, which was replaced later. I wish I had a four-wheel drive. I think it would be fun to go up the mountain the back way. So let's continue to go down the mountain the back way.
As you go down the mountain, the road slowly gets better, and then you get on to new Old 40 through threatening weather and head up another hill to another treasure.
We are at the top of the next ridge on the Appalachians. First there was Sidling Hill and now Town Hill Mountain. We always stopped here, and my God, this place looks great. Better than it did 60 years ago. There were gas pumps here, and I want you to turn around and look over here, because this is one of my favorite spots. When they built the interstate down in the valley, they decided to make it easy for tourists to see it. And so over here is an observation deck. There were machines, binoculars. You could put a quarter in and look out at the highway construction. My dad one time cautioned me not to lean up against the railing. He said, "You don't know what people have been doing on that railing." Oh my God, what memories. For this was always one place we stopped on our way east or west, and it was a major stopping point when the old National Road became US 40. Let's push on.
Yes, we've got to move on, but just a moment to take one final look at beautiful, beautiful Maryland.
On our trip across the Maryland Panhandle, we will begin to see what infrastructure was like in the early 1800s. Some of the greatest engineering talents were employed in building the old National Road, and among the great achievements were bridges. And the first one we see is the Wilson Bridge.
And the Wilson Bridge has become a kind of poster boy for the infrastructure of the old National Road, built in the early part of the 1800s. But another bridge over the Castleman River is even older and more historic.
This is a pretty amazing bridge. It's here in Grantsville, Maryland, over the Castleman River. It was the longest arch in the world at one time. It carried hundreds of thousands of wagons, and one of the really neat things is from the railing of this bridge, you can see two newer generations of highway making. The 1940s bridge, and way behind that, the Interstate Bridge. Both are really ugly compared to this arch.
Thank goodness this bridge has been preserved. But there are parts of the old National Road that have been desecrated.
I always had my dad pull off right here and drive this little tiny piece at St. Paul's Church. But somebody decided they wanted to build a road through there. So here's a little piece of the old National Road after it became US 40, asphalt with a foot of cement on either side, the classic old roadway that somebody just put a street through.
Finally, the old road takes us out of Maryland and up into Pennsylvania, where we find a reservoir that has a town underneath it.
That's a really neat bridge on US 40. across the Youghiogheny River here in Pennsylvania. There's a dam up there that forms a lake that's great for recreation. This is a rather new bridge. I remember the older one. It was narrow. My dad hated it. But before either one of these bridges, there was one down there, an early bridge. Another one of those early pieces of infrastructure on the old National Road. But you can only see it now when the lake is nearly empty.
You see, before the reservoir was built, there was a great bridge over the Youghiogheny River and a little town that got submerged eventually. But now, when the lake is at its lowest, you can see the remnants of the bridge, a ghost from another time. And there are other ghosts on the old National Road, the ghosts in the neck, a curving section of the old road, Old Highway 40, in a once vibrant and very busy Pennsylvania city.
This is Brownsville, Pennsylvania, on the old National Road, once a thriving river city with the road and the river and the railroad. And in 1836, the world's first steel arch bridge was built on the old National Road here. But some time ago, the National Road moved. Highway 40 doesn't go through downtown anymore.
It goes across town on this magnificent bridge, the Lane Bain Bridge. But if you don't need to go to Brownsville, you don't go down through the neck anymore. They've torn down some of the old buildings and most of the buildings on one side of the street. The ones that remain may be revitalized eventually, but right now it's kind of creepy. This is the bridge out of town that was replaced by the Lane Bain Bridge. I don't know, I like this one. Finally, we go up a hill, and at the top of it a sign about a dangerous mountain. It's a rough drive down into Uniontown. This is the city where engineers decided how to make FM stereo work. The weather got better, and we headed out toward Washington, Pennsylvania, then headed west across a little finger of West Virginia. It's an odd panhandle. Our destination, Wheeling, and at Wheeling, the 1847 suspension bridge that is still being used today.
And it's a little hard to understand just how important this pioneering suspension bridge here at Wheeling was, not only to the infrastructure of the old National Road, but to the art of bridge building, beautifully preserved today, connecting Wheeling to a part of Wheeling that's on an island. I remember this island from 1972. I was here during Hurricane Agnes. I got hungry, and the only place I could find open was a place called Papa Schultz's Sandwich Shop. No, it isn't Papa Schultz's Sandwich Shop anymore. But I checked with the city to make sure I hadn't just dreamt about it. This used to be owned by a man named Carl Schultz, Papa Schultz. It's had a lot of transitional owners over the years. But one of the things Papa Schultz told me was how Wheeling has remembered the floods here. There was a marker on the side of his building, but it's gone too. But there is other proof that a lot of this periodically gets underwater.
For years, statistics were kept on the depth of the flooding on a wall of a building. They tore the building down and kept the wall. But at times, most of Wheeling Island has been underwater. It's a flooding kind of thing. Here's an old photo from the 1800s showing the suspension bridge leading to nowhere. But through all of it, the 1847 Wheeling Suspension Bridge on the old National Road has remained. As we leave the Wheeling area, we find the terrain begins to change, and there are more beautiful artifacts along the road of another era, and they just happen to be more bridges.
You see this beautiful bridge up here? It's the Highway 40 bridge here in Blaine, Ohio. But behind me is the classic brick-covered S bridge, the Blaine Bridge, that was the hallmark of this part of the old National Road. It became the centerpiece of a fabulous celebration of highways and history here in the state of Ohio. And they did a wonderful job preserving it.
And it was used as the symbol of Ohio's bicentennial celebration. It's a preserved S-bridge, and Ohio is a museum of S-bridges.
And this piece of infrastructure is yet another bridge. It's a bridge over Peters Creek. And here it is on the old National Road. It's an S-bridge. Now let me explain this. Arch bridges couldn't span very much. If you came to a river or creek diagonally, why not cross it this way? And that's what these old S-bridges do. Preserved for posterity, re-bricked. Just think of all the traffic that went across here when this was still US 40.
But you have to know where to look to find the old artifacts. For example, a brick section of US 40. And if you get off of it, well, you find a treasure.
And just outside of Norwich, Ohio, is the Brick Street, the Brick Road, as it's called. But it's really the old National Road. This was the first real paving of the old National Road, and it gives you some idea of just how narrow it was. But you have to realize in the early days of the automobile and the latter days of horse and buggies, there wasn't that much traffic you were meeting. I think it's a wonderful thing that this county has not paved over this brick, for it's a loving memory of another time and another infrastructure.
Finally, it's off the precious brick onto a more drivable section of the old road, US 40, into a city that has a lot of memories for me.
We're in downtown Cambridge, Ohio on the old National Road, and where this Rite Aid pharmacy stands now, there used to be a big Buick garage. The reason I know that is that when I was in 8th grade, our car broke down going through Cambridge, and we had to take it to the Buick garage for about 6 hours. And down the street, there used to be a coffee shop on the corner. My mom and I spent the entire day in that coffee shop eating toast and drinking Coca-Cola. We continue now down the old National Road to another one of those pieces of infrastructure that set a precedent.
And you gotta trust me on this. It's the only place I know
where you can drive to the center of the river and turn left or right. It's the famous Y Bridge here in Zanesville, Ohio. And it's quite a sight.
And I often wonder how many people unfamiliar with the area couldn't figure out which way to go and then realize they were on a bridge.
So the next time you're on a narrow bridge or a winding road, think about this: making a turn in the middle of the river in Zanesville, Ohio.
And as we head farther west on the old National Road, become US 40, we get into some very early 4-lane, and then find a great example of friendliness on the road.
Almost to the mile, halfway between my uncle's house in Bethesda, Maryland, and my parents' house in Indiana, was Baker's Motel. And when some of the interstate was finished, we decided to stay here. And in the 1960s, they decided to enlarge this motel, with bulldozers coming in very early in the morning. And I remember we'd had a rough day of driving the day before, and when they built that new section in the back, well, we were staying just to the left of the office, and we couldn't sleep a wink when dawn came. And standing right there was a huge sign. It isn't there anymore. But Baker's isn't what it used to be. Neither are many places along the National Road.
In the late 1950s, there was talk all over the old National Road and US 40 in Ohio. I-70 was coming. But where would they build the first section?
The first section of I-70 through Ohio started right here, and there used to be a ramp that connected 40 with 70. So if you were headed west, it was just an easy melding. All of that's gone. The grass has grown, the cement is dried. You can't see a trace of it now. But you went over onto the brand new I-70 for 22 miles and came out in Kirkersville, Ohio. And it made sense to end that new section of I-70 right here. It came around for a mile as a 4-lane road. There was an overpass here. Old 40 swung around that way. There is a mile of old Interstate 70 down here. Only 2 lanes of it are being used. That was once part of the interstate system, but now it's a relic. Well, at this point, we leave the old National Road. We head south through central Ohio, finally into Indiana, and eventually to Route 66. So right now, let's figure out how to get around that way.
And that ghost section of I-70 is now Ohio 158. We used it to cut down to US 22, to move diagonally through some great towns, Wilmington and Lancaster, Ohio, through some towns with 25-mile-an-hour speed limits, and some beautiful rural areas that make Ohio famous. Finally, to Circleville.
And one of the things you miss when you take the interstates, that you see when you take America's back roads, are places such as this, the Ted Lewis Museum. This is Circleville, Ohio. And Ted Lewis, the native son here, eventually became one of the biggest entertainers in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, famous for his question, "Is everybody happy?" So what do you do when you don't want to take the toll roads and you don't want to take the 4-lane roads, but you have to go through Cincinnati and you want to stay on the old roads? Well, you take side streets and old highways, and sometimes you find something really interesting. This is the Arlington Heights neighborhood of Cincinnati. And believe it or not, we are in the median of an interstate highway. Probably the widest median in the United States. Part of the road went around one side of the neighborhood, part of the interstate came around the other, and we're smack dab in the middle.
Now we're making our way down beautiful Cincinnati streets to a little neighborhood called Cheviot, Ohio.
Well, we made it across Cincinnati on all the back streets and back roads, and on our way out of town, I wanted to go 2 blocks out of the way to stop right here. Remember we visited my aunt and uncle's house in the suburbs of Washington, D.C.? Well, my Aunt Pauline and Uncle Wendell lived here, and I went to visit them every summer when I was a kid. When I was about, 11 years old, my Uncle Wendell came to me and said, "Did you bring a tie?" He gave me one of his ties because he wanted to take my aunt and me to a brand new, spiffy, upscale, wonderful restaurant, the first of its kind here in Cincinnati, a McDonald's. And the McDonald's was right here, although this is not the original building. The original building, they tell me, was leveled, and this much, much bigger, newer one was built. But this is where my aunt and uncle took me to do something exciting, to go to a brand new restaurant. A man named Ben Groen bought the franchise here. He was a pioneer in putting McDonald's in this part of the Midwest. But this was a mostly Catholic neighborhood, and back then people didn't eat meat on Friday. We need a fish sandwich, he thought. So the fillet of fish was born right here. And so it's on across western Cincinnati down to the Ohio River to catch another of America's great back roads, US 50, which we'll be driving both in Indiana and Illinois, and again in Nevada, where it's the loneliest road in the U.S. Well, we made it. Another milestone through Cincinnati. The Ohio River, which we crossed at Wheeling, is just over there, and Indiana is just over there. So we took the old National Road and 40, diagonalized through Ohio to 50. In St. Louis, we'll take 66 as the adventure continues. Now it's on into Indiana on the back roads.
And as we enter Indiana, even though Old Highway 50 is technically a back road, it's still a narrow 4-lane here because this area is still part of the Cincinnati urban sprawl. And another city along the way is Lawrenceburg, and something you won't see from the interstate, the local high school football team. Football in Indiana? Shouldn't it be basketball? Well, let's go north a few miles on another old road and fix that.
Sometimes on the old roads, though, you can be disappointed. This is Milan, Indiana. This is a big school here, but it's not the building where the team played in the 1950s, the Cinderella story team that went on to beat the biggest school in Indiana, and about which the movie Hoosiers was made. I wanted to take you to the old gym, but it's not here anymore.
Sometimes you really should do some advanced research and be prepared for a lot of stops in small towns and some very confusing signs. You see, the old roads have changed over the years and moved. The road goes into Brownstown this way and then goes out to the west now, but in the 30s it went down to Medora and back up. And the real treasure I want to show you next is at Medora, at the old river crossing.
It's a wonderful place. Has a great fragrance to it of wood. I kind of wish we could drive across, but just being here is something special. It is the longest still existing covered bridge in the United States. Let's get back on Highway 50 now, and our next stop will be another kind of lost artifact when it comes to America's highways. Long before McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's, there were places like this, the Bomac Drive-In along Old Highway 50 in Shoals, Indiana. My great uncle was the dentist here, so I came over here a lot as a kid, and it was open back then. The sad thing is, there are a lot of restaurants on the old roads, like the Bomac, that are now only ghosts. And in some areas, the old road is replaced with an interstate. For example, the coming of I-69 here in the Midwest took a long time. It's one of the newest stretches of interstate in the U.S., and they couldn't decide at first where to put it.
The discussions dragged on for years. The idea was to connect Indianapolis with Evansville in the south. Some wanted a western route through Terre Haute. Others wanted the trip to go straight south and then some way find Evansville. But the winner was a compromise through my hometown of Washington. A lot of cheering went on. But before stopping in Washington, let's make one more rural stop.
And here's something you won't see on an interstate highway, a farmer's market. You know, people in big cities drive great distances to get out into the boonies for fresh fruit, natural foods, organic vegetables, but if you drive the mom and pop highways, you'll find these little markets everywhere.
And because the mom and pop highways take us through my hometown of Washington, Indiana, beautiful courthouse, isn't it? I had to stop by to see old friends and my old school, Washington Catholic.
Yeah, 4 years here at Washington Catholic High School, and I just got a call before I started this trip. The street used to be brick, but now it's asphalted. And as we travel across the U.S., we'll see a lot of cases where the old infrastructure just couldn't be saved, or where people don't care anymore. But sometimes people do care. A lot of money and planning is going into the restoration of this home on Main Street here in Washington, Indiana, dating from the 1800s, as are a lot of other homes around here. But the owners of this building are determined that it is not going to become a ghost. All right, let's head out now on more of the old road, the old US 50, down through the river bottoms. And the operative word here may be bottom, for this is the lowest part of the valley of the White River in southern Indiana. And when it does flood, sometimes 3 times a year, this is underwater. This was underwater. And this is old Highway 50. That's why in the 1930s they moved it to higher ground. And then in the 1970s, they moved it again. Except the new road occasionally gets flooded. But this is a great example of a river bottom area, and a wonderful example of why sometimes roads are underwater. And of course, you can't have river bottoms without a river. And this is the gorgeous old bridge on Highway 50 from years ago. When I was a kid growing up in the area, it was one of my favorite places, particularly at night in springtime. But it's a great example of the old truss bridges that made early highways possible.
And once you get across that beautiful bridge into Knox County on the old highway, if you have a compass, you may suddenly realize you're traveling at a 45-degree angle. Look at the area between Fritchton and Verne. You see, that was once French territory, and they do that.
And if you look at maps of America before the Revolutionary War, just about the only thing you'll see out here in the prairie is Vincennes. It is old and historic, steeped in lore, and full of firsts.
And from the Abraham Lincoln Bridge, you can see the oldest college in the U.S. outside the East Coast, the first Masonic Lodge, first Catholic Church in Indiana, first newspaper in the West.
And in the distance, the George Rogers Clark Memorial, a memorial that is the biggest memorial to one person outside of Washington, D.C. The old cathedral is back there, and this is the beautiful Abraham Lincoln Bridge.
This magnificent bridge was built in the 1930s as part of a Depression Make-Work project. It commemorates the event in 1830 when Abraham Lincoln's family moved to Illinois on the old bridge right here.
But rather than take the beautiful Lincoln Bridge across the beautiful Wabash River, I thought we'd go 25 miles south and do a little history lesson. You see, the highways came after the railroads, and by that time, many of the railroads had changed their right-of-way or abandoned a bridge. Many of the early highway bridges in this country were built on railroad bridges. Pretty spectacular, isn't it? 1 lane, a wooden floor, and we're gonna drive across into Illinois.
I know this bridge isn't going to fall down, but this is a lot creepier than I thought it would be. Once we get into Illinois, we'll head north and go back to US 50 and head towards St. Louis.
We're in Illinois now, and this is the little tiny hamlet of Billet. Behind me is a pile of rubble. That used to be the Billet General Store. A good friend of mine grew up here, and he told me it wasn't until the 1950s that Billet got electricity. And they put up a big sign on this store that said, "Billet has cold pop." Okay, down the back road now to join US 50 again and head to St. Louis.
And the first section you find is actually 4-lane. It was originally designed to be part of Interstate 64. But it didn't work out that way. But after a few miles, you can wiggle off the road and find the old 2-lane pavement. You know, the mom and pop highways. And these are the kinds of roads I like the best. But plan ahead, there are fewer services on the old road than you might expect. But now and then, you'll run into a treat.
It's a long way across the state of Illinois on the back roads from the Wabash River to St. Louis. But along the way, there are some great places to stop. As a matter of fact, the more times you travel the old back roads, the more times you'll find little pocket state parks, like Red Hills State Park near Sumner, Illinois.
Of course, on the interstate, you will find rest areas, but back before the interstates, there were roadside pull-offs and picnic tables all over the place. Now they're few and far between. That's what makes the park so nice, like the one we found.
Remember back in Vincennes, Indiana, they talked about how old everything was, and how if you looked on a map of North America at one time, all you would see would be Vincennes? Well, this is Cahokia, Illinois, and don't tell the European settlers about this place. It's the oldest city in North America, settled by Native Americans years ago, and Cahokia was a pretty big city.
Its estimated population more than 10,000 people in an area covered with mounds.
And these mounds are all over the place. As a matter of fact, some of the best of them were in a place that they leveled to make the city of St. Louis. We're about to cross the Mississippi and join Route 66, and I want to show you a bridge that used to terrify my dad. And the reason my dad hated this bridge so much is that it has a curve in the middle of it. It is the Chain of Rocks Bridge, and we are now on one of the original alignments of Route 66. You can't drive across here anymore unless you've got a motorcycle, and just a few moments ago, a bunch of motorcyclists came through. It is one of America's most historic bridges, and it's beautifully preserved. And that curve in the middle, man, it was nuts.
That 22-degree bend was necessitated because of the bridge's proximity to a water intake tower and the shipping industry's demands to not block the channel.
And I might point out before we leave this spot that it was only about 2 miles north of here that Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery got together before it went west. Well, we're about to go west and cross the Mississippi, but let's take a different alignment of old Route 66, go down through East St. Louis, and then cross the Mississippi there. And when drivers on Old 66 came down through East St. Louis years ago, that wasn't there. The Gateway Arch, of course, dates from the 1960s. But this is really the best place to see it. Not in St. Louis, but from across the river in East St. Louis. Okay, farther down the Mississippi, across into Missouri, and then we continue now on Old 66.
And as we left the parking lot of the Overlook, it began to rain. We made our way through East St. Louis, a city cut up with interstate highways, onto a ramp of a bridge to take us over into St. Louis. This is one of those sturdy old bridges, very reminiscent of that railroad bridge we used to cross the Wabash River. But I feel a lot safer on this one. Finally through St. Louis and into the suburbs, and what do you know? We found the old routing again of US 66. Over the decades, a lot of people have sent back postcards as they traveled 66 from some wonderful places, including this marvelous place.
Pretty neat, huh? If you're a postcard collector, you've seen this a lot. This is Pacific, Missouri, or Missouri, if you will. This is Old 66, and hundreds of thousands of people stop to get postcards of this. It's holes in the rock in Pacific, Missouri.
I wish I could tell you that Mother Nature made that beautiful rock formation with the holes in it, but that's not the case. These limestone palisades in Pacific, Missouri are full of silica, one of the main ingredients in making glass. And over the years, a lot has been taken out of the hills. There's even a little pocket park here. It's so popular. Well, back onto what's left of 66, and then off on an off-ramp to another major 66 attraction.
And over the last 85 years, a lot of postcards have been sent back from this place. It's probably one of the most famous tourist traps, maybe I should say tourist attractions, along Old 66, even though you have to go 4 or 5 miles off the road to get here. This is Merrimack Caverns. This is where everybody stopped along the way.
And people traveling Route 66 have been amazed at what they've seen at Merrimack Caverns for decades and decades. If you have the time to go down into the caverns, some of the rooms are absolutely spectacular. And there's something else here. This is Jesse James territory, and the legend is that Jesse and his brother hid out right here at Merrimack Caverns. What a nice statue. Now we're headed out to one of the most famous parts of Missouri, the Ozarks.
That's pretty rare traffic through here. This is a rare, often photographed, abandoned section of Old 66 in Missouri through what is called Hooker's Cut. In a day and age when everything was 2-lane, a 4-lane, very pioneering, about 8 or 9 mile stretch of 66 was cut through the hill, largely because of a nearby military base.
And that military base in the Ozarks is not too far from where we are now, Hooker's Cut at Devil's Elbow. The fort is Fort Leonard Wood. Even before the Second World War, there was concern that there might be mobilization, but you can't move big equipment through small roads and bridges.
And much of the rationale to spend all that money to build the Hooker Cut was that military vehicles couldn't get down through here. This is the old routing of Route 66, the bridge here at what is called Devil's Elbow, a sharp bend in the river. And during the past couple of years, this area saw its worst flooding ever. I would be standing in water right now if I were here then, and the bridge had to be put back together. This was a mess.
And in many parts of the Ozarks, especially here on the Big Piney River, things can really get underwater. The bridge was in danger for a while, and several of the local businesses that relied on tourism had a hard time digging out.
But I'll tell you, if you want to trace Old 66, you have to come here. You have to get off the interstate onto the old road, onto the older road, and find Devil's Elbow. It's quite a place.
Heading west, you really discover the meaning of the phrase long distance between cities. And then I discovered something interesting. Remember we talked about rest parks in Illinois?
Before crossing the border into Kansas, I found something here in Missouri that's kind of interesting. It's a rest park, a roadside pull-off. It's got picnic tables and a deteriorating barbecue pit. This, though, is reminiscent of something that you used to see everywhere. The old maps were cluttered with little triangles showing where these pull-offs were. And when I was a kid with my mom and dad, we would quite often get bologna and cheese out of the ice chest and bread out of the back seat. And we'd eat lunch in a place like this.
And we weren't alone on those old mom-and-pop highways. The picnic areas were always full.
Well, they've got rest parks on the interstate, but they're snazzy with vending machines. This is a real rest park. We'll be in Kansas in a few minutes.
A few miles of US 54 to go and rain showers again, but changeable weather can be a hallmark of the prairie states. Just ask Dorothy.
Well, we made it to Kansas. I've been looking around for Dorothy or Auntie Em or Toto. Can't find any of them. I was thinking, though, how different the geography is here than when we were in Maryland, for example, or even coming through the Ozarks. It's going to be a while before things change very much. Everybody said to me, Dennis, why do you want to drive across Kansas? There's nothing but corn for a day and a half. Well, there's no way to get to the West Coast without doing that, so let's make the most of it.
And this part of America has some great little towns, fun stores, mom and pop restaurants, and if you look down the right side street, you might find a remnant of the past.
By golly, you never know what you're going to find when you get off the beaten path. Here in Iola, Kansas is a Dairy Queen, but not just any Dairy Queen, it's a really old Dairy Queen. You know, there was a time in this country on the old roads that before the McDonald's and the Burger Kings and the Wendy's, Dairy Queen was the place to go for a sandwich.
Yes, Dairy Queen was there in the very beginning of franchising, 1940, the first to serve soft serve. Many of the stores are now closed, but some are open, many year-round, including this one. And down another Kansas road, a little tiny town with an unlikely museum. Unfortunately, by the time I got there, it had started raining again.
Eldorado, Kansas, and a neat kind of museum, signs of all kinds of gas stations, many of them oil companies not in business anymore, and oil derricks and drilling equipment. In Kansas? Didn't you think Texas is the oil center? Well, at one time, a lot of oil came out of this part of Kansas, so much oil that it's remembered today as one of the most productive oil fields ever tapped. Boy, what a great collection of signs. So the next time you think about the oil patch, include Kansas.
Have you ever gone somewhere and felt you've been there before? Well, going through one city in Kansas, something felt strange to me.
We're smack dab in the center of Kansas on an already windy day in Hutchinson, Kansas. And you know, this is deja vu for me. I've never been to this basketball arena before, but in a way I have. You see, when I worked in radio in Indiana, in Vincennes, the junior college basketball team there was a national powerhouse, coming here many, many times. I was the guy back at the radio station who pushed the button and said, "Now let's go to Hutchinson." And you'd hear, and the boss would be in Hutchinson. Now I'm here. But as I say, I feel as if I've been here before.
And the headquarters of the National Junior College Athletic Association is right here in Hutchinson. And Hutchinson has hosted the finals since 1945.
As I was looking at aerial photographs of the trip we're now taking across the U.S., I thought somebody had drawn a red line through Kinsley, Kansas. Nope, it's a brick street. Now that's not unusual. Hundreds of thousands of blocks of brick street were very common in the last century. But it's really nice to see blocks and blocks and blocks of preserved brick. For this was the paving material of the era. Let me tell you one thing about Kinsley, Kansas you might not know. Geographically, this is the center of the 48 states.
What happens if a tornado is headed roughly to the north in rural Kansas, and the tornado's a mile wide, and your city is less than a mile wide?
Today it is a threatening, drizzly, overcast day in Greensburg, Kansas. A mile-wide tornado came right through the center of town. There's the new city hall over there, and wiped out everything. What the people of Greensburg have been doing is to rebuild. There used to be houses here, but they've decided in the rebuilding, what they're building is going to be environmentally friendly. They're building a green community here in Greensburg. But all the locals remember that day when the sky turned black.
But unlike the fictional tornado of The Wizard of Oz, the ending here was entirely different.
Speaking of fact and fiction and fantasy, our next stop, well, remember Matt Dillon?
I'm that man. Matt Dillon, United States Marshal.
Welcome to Dodge City. I've been looking for Miss Kitty and Doc and Chester, and course, Matt Dillon. I've listened to an awful lot of those old radio episodes of Gunsmoke, and I said to myself, if I ever got to this part of the world, I would have to go to Dodge City, Kansas. There is so much fact and fiction here, nearly a decade of Gunsmoke on radio and 2 decades on television. A lot of it was true, but a lot of it was just great adventure.
Ubiquitous radio actor William Conrad, who would also have a great career in television, was Matt.
It's a chancy job, and it makes a man watchful and a little lonely.
Doc was played by Howard McNear, who would be Floyd the Barber on Mayberry. Chester was Parley Bear, one of the mayors of Mayberry and better known as the voice of the Keebler Elf. And Miss Kitty was Georgia Ellis, who effectively retired when the show went to television.
Dodge City's a wonderful combination of old and new, the tourist trade relying on the legend of Gunsmoke, the cattle drives here to Dodge City, the coming of the railroad, the Santa Fe, which many of the locals used to call the Santa Fe. There are still brick streets here, and an awful lot of people who love to tell the story of Dodge City, even before it was immortalized in Gunsmoke.
And just west of town are the Santa Fe Trail tracks. There's a walkway that takes you up a hill where you can look down and see history carved into the mesa.
It's a little bit of a walk up to the top of this ridge. But this is a viewing area onto a large plateau where tens of thousands of American pioneers went west, mainly on the Santa Fe Trail. This is not a good time of year to find them, but when the grass is at its lowest, you can see the Wagon Ruts out here, just outside of Dodge City. You know, the pioneers didn't travel in single file. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wagons abreast to make better use of all the grass. You just have to close your eyes and imagine.
And a couple of days farther west from here, the pioneers had to make a big decision.
And just as we saw those ruts back in Dodge City where the Santa Fe Trail went west, when people got to what is now Ingalls, Kansas, they had to make a decision. Would they continue west or ford the Platte River and go south? 2 divergent routes that would meet later. But for many of the early pioneers, the decision they made could be one of life and death.
We entered Kansas from the east, went in through Eldorado, Hutchinson, Dodge City, and then Garden City, and it is here that we'll change our trajectory, go north, and head through a little tiny corner of Nebraska. But first, before leaving Garden City, I wanted to drive out to one of the suburbs.
We're outside of Holcomb, Kansas, and you can smell what's going on in there. A truck is just about to come down this road, and it will be a truck full of cattle. Now, when you think of Tyson, though, you think of chicken. But inside this massive plant, huge plant, start to finish, on the hoof to hamburger, it's beef.
And although a lot of people think of Tyson's when they think of chicken, its main shipments outside the U.S. are of beef. It also owns Sara Lee, Hillshire Farms, Jimmy Dean, and State Fair products.
And where do you suppose Tyson's beef processing gets all of its beef that come in via the trucks we've been seeing? Well, it all starts in massive feedlots like this with what look to be contented cows.
And you keep those cows contented by feeding them corn, the kind people don't eat.
You know, if you spend very much time in farm country in northwestern Kansas, say at a restaurant, and listen to what people are talking about, the farmers always mention the Ogallala Aquifer, a massive underground reserve of water that makes farming like this possible, and has since the pioneers first came here. The problem is it's a rather finite resource, And already many farmers have been mandated a lower allotment of just how much water they can use.
Modern statistical information and satellite analyses show that this part of Kansas is using more than its fair share of the water underground. You know, all of this extraction began in pioneer days when they started using windmills to pump water. Well, we got pretty far off the beaten track for that one, but look where we're going now, down a farm road that's got cattle on it. But I was told it would be worth it, that if we got this far off the beaten track and looked into the distance, we would begin to see something pretty spectacular. And so around one of the curves, well, it looks a little bit like Stonehenge.
And if ever there were a great place to get off the beaten track, this is it. We're about 10 miles off US 83 in the middle of nowhere, 20 miles north of Scott City, Kansas. And these are the Monument Rocks, storied in history. Tour groups have come here for years. School kids from Kansas have come here. A really interesting set of rock formations carved by the wind.
Geologists say these formations go back 80 million years. They contain fossils of fish when all of this was underwater in a huge mid-continent sea.
Wow. Another example of something you don't see on the interstate. And please, if we're learning anything on this trip, is don't use a GPS unless you get lost. Get an honest-to-God map, and as many as you can, so you can find places like this.
Likely, a GPS would not take you out in the middle of nowhere like this. We'll be back to the major highway in just a minute, and when we get there, a little bit of a surprise.
Our last stop in Kansas is kind of a graveyard. You see a lot of these former repair shops for tractors here. Now those tractors are what you might call derelict tractors. They say the horse made the West, but certainly here in the Great Plains and farm country, tractors played an enormous part. And I thought before we left Kansas, we'd just take a little look at this and try to remember a time when these were spick and span and painted up and plowing to beat holy heck.
Some of the original tractors were huge. They tried to make tractors run on just about anything. Today's mega tractors are magnificent, and they make mega farming possible.
And I've been told there's something special about some of these old ghost tractors. They've been fitted out as front-end loaders. Kind of rare. Kind of sad, too. Well, our next stop is not Colorado. It's a little bit of a surprise. We're not in Kansas anymore. We're in Nebraska. The route I picked on America's back roads goes through a little tiny corner of extreme southwestern Nebraska. As a matter of fact, when I go back into Nebraska, we'll only be there for about 5 minutes, but I thought it might be fun to add another state. And as I said coming in, no, Dorothy, we're not in Kansas anymore. Or we were then.
And it seems our brief time in Nebraska just flew by.
Hey, how did you enjoy your 8 minutes in Nebraska? Colorado now, the altitude should start rising, and we should see some more sights as the geography changes dramatically in the next 200 miles or so. This is the Mile High State.
Some beautiful highways here in Colorado, and by the time we got to our next stop, the altitude was 4,444 feet.
This is Yuma, Colorado, but there's a temptation to call cities like this silo cities. But these are grain bins, I've been told, where massive bushelage of corn gets stored. And you see that gray area in the middle, massive drying machines that take the moisture out of the corn, which is often picked when it's a little too wet. You'll see these all over this part of Colorado. They are a vital part of American agriculture.
And this one is owned by a co-op, a cooperative. grain raisers getting together to provide a place to dry and store their product until it goes to market. As we continue our drive through this part of the world, sometimes you'll see in the distance a wind turbine, and at one point we found a staging area for their construction.
It's a little hard to see from this angle, but this is the closest I can get. These are blades for wind turbines. When they move these, it takes a truck and a half to haul them down the highway, because some of the electrical generating wind turbines you see along highways are immense.
But nothing like the ones in Europe. But here in America, wind farms are cropping up everywhere. Well, it's back on the highway now and heading northwest to that huge area above Denver. And in another place you'll not find on the interstates, I found more antiques.
This is an oil well drilling rig, and it's tall enough so they can stack two pieces of drilling pipe on top of each other. This one may be 60 years old. The equipment here seems to last forever.
There must be $1 billion of this stuff sitting around the oil patch. Maybe that's why oil exploration is so expensive. We're heading now toward Fort Collins, Colorado, and on many of the back roads we kept running in and out of rain. But you know what? There's something nice about a rainstorm out here where there are long vistas. I wonder why we didn't have this rainbow in Kansas while we were looking for Dorothy. We've been going through Colorado, coming in from the east and going to the Fort Morgan area, escaping the interstate, then heading up through Fort Collins into Wyoming. And in Fort Collins is the world's most boring radio station.
We're northwest of Fort Collins, Colorado, and it's a great time to call 303-491-7111. Can you hear this?
At the tone, 21 hours, 29 minutes.
That's a product of a radio station called WWV. It's one of the many transmitters that broadcast the time standard, the precise time of day, musical tones, and things by which industry and broadcasting set their daily processes. And their antenna farm is back there. If it weren't so hazy, we could see it.
WWV's antenna farm is typical of most international shortwave stations. Radio and TV stations, communications networks, nearly everyone who relies on the time or exact pitch tunes in to WWV.
Welcome to Wyoming. You know, I've really been looking forward to getting to Wyoming because there are so many things I want to talk about. So many things in planning this trip that I've done research on. The old railroad, the mountain pass, a book by Mr. Michener, and the Lincoln Highway. So let's go to Wyoming.
Wyoming is the 10th largest state but has the fewest people, 500,000, about the same population as Fresno, California.
I don't know whether you can hear me over the sound of the wind. We're near Tie Siding, Wyoming, and this primitive gravel road was the original alignment of the Lincoln Highway. 1913, the idea to link New York City and San Francisco with one continuous road, no matter how bad it was.
It's fun to drive the old right-of-way of the 1913 Lincoln Highway, but you do so in a new car. Imagine this road in worse shape in a Model T Ford. Why people ventured out, well, I guess it was the adventure. And in the middle of nowhere at what used to be Sherman, Wyoming, a monument to the Ames brothers, the movers and shakers behind the railroad. Sherman used to be quite a place. It had a roundhouse, a railroad yard, and this is where they changed crews and added or subtracted engines to go up and down the Continental Divide.
And near the Ames Brothers Monument is a stretch of road called Iron Horse Road. Put two and two together. This used to be the roadbed of the Transcontinental Railroad. But when the Lincoln Highway Foundation put the road through here in 1913, it used the old railroad bed as the bed for the highway. And that's very common out here. And there's another huge monument here along the Lincoln Highway. Now they call I-80 the Lincoln Highway. And that's the bronze bust of Abraham Lincoln, the man for whom the highway was named. Behind it is another monument to a man who helped form the Lincoln Highway Association. It's all on the interstate now, which they call the Lincoln Highway, but you and I know better. In our effort to get off the beaten path and drive the back roads, we outdid ourselves during the past hour, taking the old Lincoln Highway, the dirt and gravel and bone-shaking road. We're going to go into Laramie now and then head due west into the Rockies.
It turned out to be a confusing day in Wyoming and one of a lot of U-turns. We were going west out of Laramie to Centennial, then north, cutting across and up to Medicine Bow, then take the old Lincoln Highway into Rollins. But before the day was over, we'd have to make a lot of decisions. But I'll say this, the road from Laramie to Centennial is spectacular. The altitude keeps increasing, and there's such a wonderful sense of fresh air and openness here.
We're up in the early part of the Wyoming Rockies in Centennial, Wyoming, 8,076 feet. It's kind of quiet here right now, but during ski season, they tell me you can't find a place to park. We're going to make a sharp right-hand turn here and head toward Medicine Bow. No, we're not on old US 30 or the Lincoln Highway now. We're just out going across the mountains.
And going across the mountains may be easier said than done. Very shortly after leaving Centennial, things started happening. The first thing was we ran out of asphalt. We ended up on a gravel road that got more narrow, and finally my navigator and I decided we would tear up the rental car if we went any farther. So the answer was to make a U-turn and retrace our steps all the way back down that part of the mountain we'd gone up and find an alternate route. So back on the map, we went to Centennial, and we were going to go north across the mountain ridge to Medicine Bow, but here's the alternative. Go west across another mountain to Saratoga, then north, then up to Medicine Bow, then down south to finally catch the road over to Rollins. Wow!
Whether you're up here hiking or skiing in the winter, or just going through the very high roads as we are, and you can get dingy up here, you know, the air is thin. You do want to stop by the welcome centers, particularly on U.S. Park Service land, because they've got a wealth of information about this beautiful God's country.
And this is a part of Wyoming that, well, you just love to stay here.
And our next stop here in God's country is going to be the summit, one of the highest paved mountain passes you can drive on anywhere in the U.S. My ears will stop popping.
I asked my navigator to drive because I wanted to take some pictures, but all of a sudden, I simply fell asleep. When I woke up, we were in Saratoga, Wyoming, a cute little town where we found something else that you usually don't see on any interstate highway anywhere in the U.S. This lady.
Saratoga, Wyoming. And this is one of the forks of the Platte River. You know, as we discover more about the West and the way the early settlers came west, the Platte River keeps coming into that equation. For in many ways, it was the first interstate pathway to get to the West, even though the water was running the wrong way.
The Platte River drains a huge area in 3 states. It is the main corridor that the pioneers used through Nebraska. And even today, this part of America has some of the strongest and richest agriculture.
Next, we're going to go north and find some more of classic Lincoln Highway lore.
And to get to Medicine Bow, we cut across country on a country road and then got off on this little 2-lane cow path. It leads to the abandoned Medicine Bow Airport, where my research tells me we're going to find something that's so rare you won't believe it.
And along an old road in Wyoming, we found this jewel of another era. My navigator Bud Dillon's out looking at it now. On the ground below this aircraft beacon is a great big concrete arrow.
You see, in the 1920s, the airmail pilots didn't have sophisticated equipment. They had routes across the country. Here's where the beacon is on the New York-San Francisco trip. All of the stops along the way had a numbered house, a beacon, and an arrow. The 100 or so that used to be around have crumbled, and only a few are left. And if you can find them, you're darn lucky. We then headed into Medicine Bow and got stopped by a freight train. Now let me tell you, when you travel the mom-and-pop highways, you're going to get stopped by trains a lot. But it was the railroad that actually brought the Lincoln Highway here. And the story centers around this beautiful building.
Here in Medicine Bow, Wyoming, there are two great stories. The first one is of the Virginian Hotel. The railroad had passenger service through here in the early 1900s, and some gentleman built that hotel. 2 years later, the railroad stopped stopping here. Then in 1913, when plans were announced for the Lincoln Highway, he thought, you know, it really ought to go through Medicine Bow. And he pulled every string he could to make sure that this became the Lincoln Highway, which it did.
Everybody in southeastern Wyoming wanted the road through their city. Medicine Bow wanted a northern route following the railroad and then west into Rollins. People in Elk Mountain wanted a southern route, shorter, more direct, but more prone to being snowed in winter. So the owner of the Virginian Hotel made about 100 signs, similar to the modern-day Lincoln Highway signs. He and his friends marked the road through Medicine Bow and then told the State Highway Department, don't worry, we've already finished it.
And so the folks in Elk Mountain were left high and dry, and the Lincoln Highway came right through here until Elk Mountain got the last laugh. In the 1970s, the interstate came through, but it was a mixed blessing. Then the state recognized that the major road should go through Elk Mountain, but there is no interchange here. So until the interstate opened, 30, US 30, where we were in Medicine Bow, remained the Lincoln Highway.
And the old section of the Lincoln Highway, become US 30 through Medicine Bow, is a kind of museum to the way the road used to look. Very similar to a preserved section of US 66 in Arizona. In both cases, the interstate made a shortcut and left them preserved.
It's a bright morning here in Rollins, Wyoming. We're at the old train station here. There are a lot of parallel tracks because overnight a lot happens here in Rollins. This is a major switching point. But I want to bring up one thing. As we continue to follow the highways, and right now the old Lincoln Highway, the railroads were often here first. You see, railroad engineering is tough. The railroads can't do this. The grade has to be constant, so the highway engineers thought if it was good enough for the railroad, it's good enough for the highway.
And west of Rollins, it becomes more difficult to find the old Lincoln Highway. You have to keep cutting back and forth on and off the 4-lane.
We've just crossed the Continental Divide, but it's not a ridge, and on this side you're on the Pacific side, and that side you're on the Atlantic side. The Continental Divide splits and wiggles all over here. And in the middle of that is the Great Basin, which we have just entered. Rain that falls here doesn't go anywhere. It stays here. And this is the largest unfenced area in the United States.
And on the way to Green River, the new road sits on top of the old road with signs to prove it.
And along the Lincoln Highway, there were a lot of postcard shots, Kodak moments. This whole area coming into Green River, Wyoming is spectacular.
And many of the old hand-tinted postcards sold in Green River showing the Palisades in the area became treasured souvenirs of early drivers on the Lincoln Highway.
Some time ago I mentioned the problem that much of the old Lincoln Highway here in Wyoming is underneath one side of the 4-lane. But here west of Green River there's a magnificent section. And this really gives you an idea of what US 30 and before that the old Lincoln Highway looked like. Welcome to Little America here in Wyoming. This place is hard to describe. When it was the original Lincoln Highway through here, this began as a small restaurant and a gas station. Then it began to bill itself as the world's largest gas station. Now it's a dynasty here in this part of Wyoming. It's a legend across most of the interstate highways. And it is at this point that we do a little course correction. US 30, the old Lincoln Highway, heads north toward Salt Lake City. And that's where we're going. It's sparser territory, fewer things to talk about, but they tell me it'll be some great scenery.
And the predictions were right. Higher altitudes, more hills, and some beautiful streams and small rivers.
Gorgeous spot, isn't it? This is the kind of thing that a wonderful woman named Effie Price Gladding wrote about. In 1915, she and her husband drove from California to New Jersey, and she wrote about the trip in a pioneering book about driving across America. And she said that her favorite places were streams, peaceful places like this.
And the book she wrote was a guide for intrepid drivers going across the Lincoln Highway at their own peril. But they were in better shape than the pioneers.
Along the old Lincoln Highway, about 30 miles outside of Kemmerer, Wyoming, is this flat plain. This is where two major trails the pioneers used to go west. Remember when we were in Dodge City, Kansas, we found the ruts for the Santa Fe Trail? Well, that was used by people going to California and slightly to the south. This was the northern corridor for those pioneers going west in that era before the Civil War.
And when we arrived in Kemmerer, I saw something on the side of the old Lincoln Highway that I knew I had to stop and talk about.
And all along the old roads, the merchants and the tourist traps tried to outdo each other. Here in Kemmerer, Wyoming, is a gaudy pink motel called the Chateau Motel. I don't know how many decades ago it closed, but it's a magnificent example of the kind of, what would you call this, campy architecture that you see along the old road.
And I managed to find yet another section of the old road outside of Kemmerer, and followed it for quite a while until I took a turnoff to go to what has been described as one of America's most unusual museums. It looks at the geology of millions of years ago.
Boy, what an incredible place this is. A timeline of geographic history along the railing that goes back 500 million years. This is a wonderful place. It would kind of be a great geologist field trip, maybe going to Mecca for a geologist, for this valley is full of fossils, and this is called Fossil Butte, Wyoming. And it's so far off the beaten track, you really have to do research to find it. But what a find it is. So the next time you see a sign that says some kind of museum or nature center a couple of miles off the road, take the turnoff.
We got back onto the old alignment of the Lincoln Highway and headed toward Utah. And coming up in a moment, watch what we're going to drive over. It's called a cattle gate. It's a bunch of bars the cattle are afraid to cross. They put them there instead of fences. The geology seems to be changing again, and now we're going into yet another state.
Well, state number 13, if I did my math correctly, Utah. I had no idea it got this windy up here. Now we're headed to the north side of the Great Salt Lake and some really interesting historical sites, and hopefully some decent geography along the way.
And I wasn't disappointed at all. From my earlier experiences, I knew that Utah had a great variety of geography, but I had never been this far north or this far east in Utah. And suddenly, well, it began to look like Vermont or parts of Colorado. But you know, I had the Great Salt Lake on my mind all this time, so when I came down into a valley and saw this, I was really surprised.
Doesn't seem like that long ago, we were in Garden City, Kansas. Now we're in Garden City, Utah, and this is Bear Lake and Bear Lake State Park. And it wasn't that many hours ago, we were in completely different terrain. That's one of the good things about taking the back roads and discovering America. We went from the high, I don't know what it was, with stark nothing, to a really beautiful recreation area in just a couple of hours.
After leaving the beautiful area around the lake, we headed west toward the northern part of the Salt Lake City area, going through the college town of Logan. From here on, it's fairly urban until we got to Tremonton, Utah, and another interesting motel.
Remember when we found that god-awful pink motel that hadn't been open for decades? One of those tourist traps along the old Lincoln Highway? Well, in my travels, I've come across another motel from another era that is still open. It's the Marble Motel in Tremonton, Utah, and it first opened its doors in 1942. Kind of cute, isn't it? And the rooms are really nice.
And the Marble Motel is a great example of the kind of hospitality you'll find on the mom and pop highways, the back roads. Speaking of back roads, it took 40 minutes of back road driving from Tremonton, Utah, to get to someplace I've been wanting to visit for a very long time.
During this back roads trip across the country, we've thrown out a couple of ideas and gone to some unexpected places we didn't think we'd see. But from day one, I knew that I had to come here, about as far off the beaten track as you can get. For something happened here 100 years before man landed on the moon that for its time was just as important. For right here is where they struck the golden spike and completed the Transcontinental Railroad. A trip that used to take the better part of a year, a trip during which more than 20,000 people died, could now be completed in a week.
The Central Pacific had started laying track in Sacramento, the Union Pacific in Omaha. The Central Pacific laid less track because it had to cross both the Sierras and the Rockies. The Union Pacific had easier going. But the two track-laying teams and surveying teams had passed each other for 100 miles or so. They were greedy. They were paid by the mile. So Washington called a halt to it and said, guys, you gotta meet at Promontory.
So if you really want to get off the beaten path, go to Promontory Summit, Utah. Not Promontory Point. Promontory Summit. It's about as far off the beaten track as you can get. But history, real history, was made here. And when the last spike was driven, it suddenly became the United States of America.
It's back out the back road and eventually in the far northern reaches of Utah back onto a 2-lane that got covered up with a 4-lane road. Then I looked at the map and decided,
Greetings from Idaho. Now let me get back into Utah here. Remember when we went through a little tiny part of Nebraska? Well, on the back roads this time, I realized we were only 2 miles from Idaho. So, a little side trip.
So when we got into downtown Snowville, the farthest north point of our planned trip, we jogged up to the state line and went into Idaho, adding yet another state. Then back down to Snowville and west on Utah 30, and we started smelling something.
We're standing on Utah Highway 30 near a little hamlet called Rosette. There are no big towns in this part of Utah. This is literally out in the middle of nowhere. And cars like this coming by, well, they're very rare out here. We're about 500 miles from the California fires, but you can smell the smoke here. And you should be able to see mountains in the distance, but you can't. A little ecological lesson in just how far that smoke can spread.
And checking the weather charts for the day we were in Rosette, we were smack dab in the middle of where the high-level winds were carrying the smoke.
Greetings from Nevada. You know, it's funny, I lived in Las Vegas for a while, and when I moved there, I called it Nevada. And everybody said, no, it's not Nevada, it's Nevada. I said, that's kind of ugly sounding. They said, we don't care. That's the way we pronounce the state. So, Nevada, 2 trucks here. It's really funny. I've done a lot of recording on isolated roads. Roads that were isolated until I started talking. Anyway, Nevada, then California. But before we get into California, we will go through some of the most isolated highways in America.
We'll be going from here on the border, southwest to the interstate, and then we'll do something I hate, having to take an interstate highway and doubling back, but there's no other way to get to the lonely road that gets to Ely. And then the big challenge, taking the loneliest highway in the U.S., heading for California. But that's another story. Meanwhile,
here at the state line between Utah and Nevada, in Wendover and West Wendover, right about here there used to be an old 4-sided telephone pole. It was considered to be the most important telephone pole in the United States. But it's been moved because of sprawl. It's preserved up on the interstate somewhere. The point of it is, in the 19-teens, in the East Coast, the farthest you could call west was Denver. Now you can call anywhere in the world. The reason is that the telephone repeaters, the amplifiers, weren't very good. But a new type of amplifier was invented, and they strung wires from Sacramento and from the east, and they met right here. And the splice was made at that telephone pole. And the first call was then made transcontinentally.
And before we leave Wendover, let's take a back road to the Wendover Airport. During World War II, it was an air base that helped end the war.
During World War II, this place was teeming. A little city of 20,000. It's the U.S. Army Air Corps' base at Wendover, Utah, and it's all but, well, falling apart or destroyed now, except for the building behind me. This building is being meticulously put back together because, you see, this base was the staging area for B-17s and the massive B-29, one of them outfitted to drop the atomic bomb. And this is now called the Enola Gay Hangar.
And from that hangar, preserving the memory of the crew of the plane that dropped the atomic bomb, we head south, beginning 400 miles of really boring driving in Nevada. But out in the middle of nowhere, there's a great monument to something that happened just before the Civil War.
It's a pretty neat logo. It commemorates something that is well remembered in this country, even though it didn't last 4 years. In the old days, the Pony Express riders ran right across here.
And considering how stark this part of Nevada is, it's a wonder they made it at all.
So far on this trip, we've been on the Old National Road, US 40, US 50, Route 66, the Prairie Highways, and finally the Lincoln Highway. And look at this. North of Ely, Nevada, about 35 miles of abandoned Lincoln Highway. In this area, it's US 93, and they put the new road about a mile over there. A rare instance when they didn't improve the old road. If I had a four-wheel drive, I know where I'd be going right now.
And it's probably a good thing I couldn't afford a four-wheel drive. Finally, we turn west at Ely and find a sign that says it all.
This is a neat sign behind me. It talks about this road as being the loneliest road in America. You know, Highway 50, which was part of the old Lincoln Highway through Nevada, got that title in a derogatory magazine story years ago. But the tourism industry here has turned it into a real asset. But you don't really realize how lonely this road is until you get out on it.
And yes, I knew that this road was going to be miles and miles of miles, and it would be hours before we got to any mountain passes. But suddenly, off to the left, I saw what looked like a group of small mountains and some very odd scenery. But I found out it was not there because of Mother Nature.
These aren't mountains behind me. And what you see behind me is only part of about 5 or 6 miles of those mountains. Those are piles of stuff left over when they copper mined here at Ruth, Nevada. You know, I end up with a lot of trash, but this is kind of mind-boggling.
And copper mining is about the worst for digging holes and leaving a mess. Before we left Ely, we tanked up the car and got some extra food and soft drinks. But the more we drove across the loneliest highway, the more I wondered what it must have been like for the pioneers. No air conditioning and stuff like that.
In the 1800s, this was called the Cape Horn Stage Stop along US 50, the loneliest road in America, so they call it. We got here from Ely in about 2 hours. It might have taken 4 days to get here in an uncomfortable stagecoach that wasn't air-conditioned or heated. And when you get out in the middle of no place like this, you have a much higher respect for those who went before.
And the road just goes on and on. Occasionally there's a farmhouse or a cluster of farm equipment, but there isn't much. There's Eureka and Austin, and finally the end of the road will be signaled at Fallon. And as you get closer to Fallon, you get into some mountains. There are 4 or 5 interesting mountain passes out here. And wouldn't you know it, just as we're going over the last mountain ridges to get through all of this lonely highway, we run into stop traffic. Again, it's happened several times here on the back roads. But finally we're out of all of that, down onto the flats and into a more urban, congested area. Our loneliness on the lonely road is over.
The long trek across America's loneliest road is over. We're in Fallon, Nevada. About 5 miles out of town, the terrain changes and it becomes somewhat urban. Now we veer northwest and visit a city that's famous for divorces.
We're really in the home stretch now, headed to Reno and on to San Francisco. But a little ways out of Fallon, Nevada, something caught my eye.
That's a neat old bridge, isn't it? It's called a through truss because the guts of it are on top the roadway. Anyway, a lot of people forget that, particularly in the 1800s, bridges like this were bought in kit form. And there were companies around the U.S. from which you could order a bridge of any size and have it delivered.
And ironically, a lot of those 1800s do-it-yourself bridges are still being used today. Well, a short, pleasant drive now up to that city I talked about where people like to get a divorce.
It may not be the classic Reno sign you remember. This is the third archway on the main drag, Virginia Street here in Reno, an oasis in this part of Nevada. And for many decades, a city closely linked to quickie divorce.
Here's the original sign in Reno, the original archway and the newer one, each reflecting their own time. Reno has long been known as a second Vegas and as a quickie divorce capital. Charlie Chan even came here in the 30s to work on a divorce case. Then it's into California on the old Donner Pass Road. You go down through a gorgeous little city called Truckee, which is also a stop on Amtrak, and pretty soon you're at Donner Lake. The altitude starts rising, and then you get to a bittersweet monument.
On the old Donner Pass Road by Donner Lake, the Donner family and their friends are remembered, with all kinds of markers commemorating what had to be one of the saddest chapters in the migration of pioneers to the West Coast. You see, the Donners started later than just about anybody else that year going west. They took a shortcut that was incredibly bogus, and they didn't know it. And when they got here too late to escape the snows to get over what is now Donner Pass. It's a wonderful monument, but it's too bad that it's here because of something so sad.
And as you take the old road across Donner Pass, you really wonder how they ever got the railroad up here and over the top.
I wish I could give you a better view of what's up here. This was the first alignment of the old Transcontinental Railroad. Can you see that shelf up there? And the Summit Tunnel is just over there. A crazy man named Theodore Judah said he could arrange it for the railroad to cross these mountains. And with his help, by God, it did.
Somehow Judah managed to bring the tracks up to the summit on gentle curves. In a couple of places there were strategically placed tunnels. But the problem is always winter snow. Just ask the Donner Party. Winter snows have always been an obstacle to transportation up here.
And just down from Donner Pass is something you won't see over there on the interstate or even on the old road. You have to get off of it on an older slice of road and see this curve on the railroad. I've come through here on Amtrak several times, but I was luckier than an awful lot of people back in the 1950s in a passenger train called the City of San Francisco that in a blizzard got stuck right there. And their rescue is quite a story.
The eyes and ears of the world were focused on this area in 1952 when more than 200 people aboard the train were stranded for more than 3 days before rescue workers could get there. They ran out of food and fuel. They began burning the furniture. Some people were overcome with smoke. Down the hill now from that area on the old road, which is now a very narrow 4-lane, and into the section of California north of Sacramento, trying to skirt all the major cities, staying on the back roads. Then up over a ridge, and look at this. It started getting foggy. We're headed for wine country, but you know, it got to the point where I wondered whether I would get carsick even though I was driving. Things began to get better, and finally it was down into Sonoma County. There's a lot of money here.
Well, we're almost at the end of our trip across the U.S., and taking the back roads through Central California, we ended up in wine country. There are some really impressive wineries here. And no, we haven't gone to Austria to film this. They all try to outdo each other, looking like Europe, particularly France or the grape-growing regions of Germany and Austria. Now from here, we take the back roads into San Francisco, and wrap up our trip on the mom and pop highways.
And we've decided to go into San Francisco from the north to avoid all the sprawl in Oakland. And boy, what a view.
Well, what do you know? Our journey is almost ended. And of course, behind me, the Golden Gate Bridge into San Francisco. It's a little foggy here, but it's almost always foggy part of the day in San Francisco. So from here, we're going to go into a park to a marker that explains where the old Lincoln Highway ended, and then a little bit of a surprise.
And you know, the Golden Gate Bridge is a toll bridge, but there are no toll takers anymore. You have an automatic flash pass for the car. I didn't. So they'll probably check my license plate, bill the rental car company, and I'll get a bill. By the way, did you know there's a tunnel in San Francisco? Well, we went through it on the way to a great neighborhood, and this is why people leave their heart in San Francisco. A lot of money in those homes. So up to a park and to our next monument.
You know, I kind of expected this to be more glorious. It's the marker that is at the end of the Lincoln Highway. And so much of our back road trip on US 30 and other places, and even US 50 and US 40, were parts of the old Lincoln Highway. So this is kind of the end of our trip here in San Francisco at the marker commemorating the end of the Lincoln Highway. But I think we need to stop one more place. And that place is here, the Pacific Ocean. The side of San Francisco most people don't see. We put nearly 4,000 miles on that rental car, taking a really snaking path on the back roads. My special thanks to Bud Dillon, who came along to be my navigator and to keep me awake on some of those lonely stretches. Well, there it is, a look at America on the back roads, the mom and pop highways. Now, I got to turn in my rental car.